Welcome to Primary Care Premises podcast from BW Healthcare Surveyors. I am your host, Will Ellis, and today we're going to be talking about sale and leaseback. So we're going to be talking about how sale and leaseback works, what the pros and cons are of sale and leaseback, and how surveying firms or organisations can take you through that process. So what is sale and leaseback? Sale and leaseback is ultimately where you would sell the premises to an external investor. An investor would come in, purchase the premises, and lease the surgery back to the GP partnership. So you would still run the surgery, you'd still be providing medical services, you'd just no longer have the burden of owning the premises. So it is a very, very popular option, particularly for practices who are perhaps struggling with GP recruitment. So practices where partners are retiring and you're struggling to find partners to come in and replace them, or perhaps partners aren't willing to purchase or find the funds to buy into practices. Sale and leaseback is an ideal solution for those practices. So when we think about sale and leaseback, what are the kind of benefits of sale and leaseback? We take a number of practices through a sale and leaseback process, and what we always kind of say to them is we explain what the pros and cons are, so they've got a full idea of how that process works. So some of the benefits of sale and leaseback, some of the reasons why practices go through the process. The first thing we're always asked is about the rent. So when it comes to the rent, at the moment, as you're in an owner-occupied premises, you receive the rent from the NHS, and that just goes to the practice finances. Now, when you're in a leasehold premises, you're going to have a rent agreement with the landlord. So actually what will happen is you'll receive the rent from the NHS, but then you will pay that in full to the landlord, depending on your repair and maintenance obligations, which we'll get to in a moment or two. But normally, presuming that everything is as it should be, you will receive the rent from the NHS and pay that in full to the landlord. Now, that should be the case for the duration of the lease. So even when the landlord instigates a rent review, which they probably will do every 3 years, they'll propose an increase in rent. You should have protections in the lease to ensure that that rent cannot exceed what you're getting reimbursed. So at no point during your lease should you be paying the landlord more than what you're getting reimbursed. Now, that is only on the proviso that you have the necessary protections in the lease. So that is why it is so important that you get specialist advice when you're going through this process. Specialist advice from surveyors, solicitors, just to make sure you have those necessary protections to make sure the rent you're receiving from the NHS fully covers what you're paying the landlord. So it can also reduce the risk and responsibility of property ownership. So when you're in a tenant in a leasehold premises, traditionally, you would only be responsible for the internal repair and maintenance of the premises. The landlord would take on those responsibilities for the external repair and maintenance of the premises. So you'd no longer have to worry about repairing and maintaining the external repair and maintenance. Now, I will caveat that because what often happens is landlords don't actually want that responsibility either. So what they will potentially do is actually back that responsibility back to you as the practice. So there is a possibility that you will actually still be responsible for everything. But if that is the case, then you will be able to retain some rent that you receive from the NHS. So you would receive the rent from the NHS, and rather than paying that in full to the landlord, because you're taking on what should be their responsibility, you can retain somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of the rent. And the idea is you put that into a sinking fund and use that money to pay for any repairs and maintenance that's needed on the premises. So either A, the landlord's going to take on the responsibility of the repairs and maintenance for the external part, or B, you'll still be responsible, but you should have that money stored away to cover all the costs that are needed throughout the process. And what some practices prefer is the second option. They'd actually prefer to be responsible themselves and have that money, because it means if anything goes wrong with the premises, you don't have to then go and find the landlord, contact the landlord, and wait for the landlord to sort it out. You've already got that money stored away, and you can just go and fix it as and when the problems arise. So a lot of practices actually prefer that option, but that's something you can discuss if you're wanting to go through a sale and leaseback, something that your surveying firm that assists you through that process will talk about those options and what suits you best. So number 3, it's also going to remove the burden of ongoing capital investment. So because it's not your premises anymore, you're not going to have to pay for any upgrades and improvements or extensions on the premises. It's going to be the landlord's responsibility. You will also have to get their authority for that, but we'll get to that in a moment or two. And then number 4, it's going to help attract new GP partners. So as I've already touched on, it's one of the main reasons why practices come through a sale and leaseback is because perhaps they're struggling with recruitment, they're struggling to find partners who are replacing exiting partners. We've had multiple practices who have perhaps started with 8 or 9 partners, and then because of retirement, they're whittling that down to maybe 2 or 3 partners, 3 or 4 partners. And as you're getting closer to that last partner standing, it becomes a bigger and bigger issue with what you're going to do with the premises and what you're going to do with this surgery. So that's why sale and leaseback is so great, because if one of the biggest issues for partner recruitment is struggling to find funds or not wanting the risk of property ownership, sale and leaseback just alleviates that issue. You'll no longer have the premises to worry about, you'll just have the contract. So certainly recruiting new GP partners is a big plus point for sale and leaseback. It's not a magic wand, I have to make that very clear. It's not like you've got a magic part of GP partners who are just waiting for you to become a leasehold premises. That is not the case at all. But in our experience, when you're in a leasehold premises, or those in leasehold premises, just find it a little bit easier to recruit compared to those in owner-occupied practices. Sale and leaseback can also assist with improvements, upgrades, and even extensions to the practice. So if you're in a practice, like most practices seem to be these days, that are in need of upgrades and improvements, or you're running out of space and you need extensions, but you're struggling to fund that yourselves, you can't get any grants from the ICB, there's nothing available in the area, going through a sale and leaseback and getting external investment could be a great option for you. So what investors will look at when they're going through a sale and leaseback is how they can maximize their rental income, how can they can maximize the value of the premises. And one of the biggest ways of doing that is upgrading and improving the surgery. So perhaps an investor will agree to purchase the premises, but also potentially agree to build you an extension. And from their point of view, the benefit from their point of view is if they build you an extension and that extension is approved for reimbursement, they're going to get a return of investment on that, on the money they spent on the extension. So again, that is certainly something worth exploring if you are struggling for space or in need of upgrades and improvements on the surgery, looking at potentially an investor coming in and sorting that out for you. And the last point to make is you're going to have protected rights at the end of your lease. So when your lease expires, let's say you sign a 15-year lease. When that lease expires, you will be protected, or you should be protected. Again, as long as you use representation, you should be protected under the Landlord and Tenants Act, which effectively stops the landlord from, at expiry of the lease, stops the landlord from just kicking you out and getting another tenant in, or it certainly makes it very difficult for them to do that. So you will have protection. So basically what it means, at expiry of the lease, you will have an automatic right to renew the lease under the same term. So if you sign a 15-year lease with full repair and maintenance obligations, then you can sign another lease as long as it's 15 years with full repair and maintenance obligations. As long as the terms are identical, you'll have an automatic right to renew for another 15 years. And then when that one expires, you can renew for another 15 years and so on and so forth. Okay, so look, they're the kind of main benefits of sale and leaseback. Let's talk about some of the downsides, some of the cons to sale and leaseback, or certainly some of the things you're going to need to be aware of before you go through the process. So when you've got a lease in place, it is going to restrict what you can do to the premises. So as I explained on the benefit side of things, you're no longer going to be responsible for the external, you're not going to be responsible for the upgrades and improvements to the surgery. It's going to be the landlord's responsibility. But that also means they don't have to do it if they don't want to. If they don't want to build you an extension, don't want to upgrade and improve the surgery, they're not obligated to do so. So it can restrict it. You're going to have to get authority from them to do that. But even as it is now, when you're in an owner-occupied premises, you've got to seek approval from the ICB anyway. So while you're seeking approval from the ICB, you seek approval from the landlord. And from their point of view, from a landlord's point of view, as long as there's evidence that it's going to give them a return of investment, so the money they spend, they're going to get that back in the way of increased rent, then it's certainly a discussion that you can have through the process of your lease. Number two, so a lease is going to place specific obligations on the practice. So it's just being aware, you're going to need to be aware of what the lease terms are, what your responsibilities are. So there may be clauses in the lease that ask you to perhaps redecorate every 3 to 5 years. There'll certainly be a clause in the lease. If you're signing a long-term lease for 10, 15 years, there'll be a clause in the lease that you have to keep the surgery in its existing state of repair. So whatever the state of repair is on day one of the lease has to be the state of repair at the end of the lease. Otherwise, it can just cause an awful lot of issues with dilapidations, with the landlord wanting you to bring the surgery back up to its original state. It can cost quite a lot of money. So it's just important that you keep the surgery upgraded and improved throughout the duration of the lease or just keep it in its existing repair. So a lick of paint every so often and things. So it's just being aware of what those obligations and what those clauses are in the lease so you don't fall foul of them at the end of the lease. There's going to be liabilities under the lease as well. So yes, there's a main benefit when you go through a sale and leaseback because you've no longer got the burden of owning the premises, but you still have to be a signatory on the lease. And it's going to be as an individual partners who are going to be signatories on the lease. So you're going to be responsible for the rental payments to the landlord for the duration of that lease. Now, as I said before, that's fine because the NHS are going to fully reimburse you for the rents you're paying the landlord. The NHS are also going to approve the lease, so they kind of give you an underwriting that they've agreed to do that for the duration of the lease. But that is on the proviso that you continue to provide medical services. So if for whatever reason you signed a 15-year lease, and then in 10 years, all the partners wanted to leave, there was no one to run the premises, and you had to close the surgery down, the signatories on the lease are still going to be responsible for the rent to the landlord, but you're not going to be getting the reimbursement from the NHS because you're not providing medical services. So it's just important to be aware that if you're signing a long-term lease, that the surgery is still going to be there for that period of time. The requirement for the medical services in that area, the community is still going to be required for that period of time. So it's just understanding that, because there's a major benefit to signing a long-term lease because it'll increase the value of the premises. So the longer the lease, the higher the value of the premises. They're kind of the two main factors that determine the value of a surgery when we come to sale and leaseback is the rental income and then the length of the lease or the terms of the lease. And like I said, the longer the lease, the higher the value. So there's a benefit to signing a long-term lease because you're going to maximize what you get paid for the surgery. But the downside is you're increasing your liability. So it's finding somewhere in between those two benefits and those cons to make sure everyone's happy. Finding an equilibrium between the two. Another thing to be made aware of when you go through sale and leaseback is your early redemption penalties. So if you've got a long-term mortgage, you're fixed into a long-term mortgage with your mortgage provider, it's going to be worthwhile speaking to the bank and finding out what your early redemption penalties are, if you have any. They can sometimes be astronomical. So before you go through the process or before you instigate the process of a sale and leaseback, just find out what those potential early redemption penalties are. Okay, so the next point is you must have at least 2 signatories on the lease at all times. So when you're going through a sale and leaseback, just make sure that there'll have to be at least 2 partners that are going to be signing the lease. So very few investors would want to purchase a premises with an assigned lease that only has 1 GP partner. So if that is the case with yourselves, you're a single-handed GP partner, you're wanting to go through a sale and leaseback, you're probably going to have to look at getting another partner in to be a signatory on the lease, or potentially look at transferring the contract to another entity, getting an external company to come in to be a signatory on the lease, perhaps a PCN, a GP federation and things, because from a risk perspective, an investor doesn't want to come in, purchase a premises for X amount of money on a 15-year lease, and then with just 1 GP partner as signatory, and then something happened to that GP partner, and all of a sudden they've got no one to run the premises and no one to receive or pay rent. So in order to remove that risk, they will ask for at least 2 signatures on the lease at all times. Now, if you've got 4 or 5 partners as signatures on the lease, then that's absolutely fine. And actually what potentially could happen is you'd have 5 signatories on the lease, and the first 3 that leave could actually leave without having to find anybody to replace them on the lease until you get down to that last 2. So when you're in a leasehold premises, unlike when you're in an owner-occupied premises when it's like last partner standing, in a leasehold premises it's more like last 2 partners standing, partner problem standing. So once you get down to those last 2 partners, that's when you start to cause issues. So it's just being aware of that really. And if you are in a multi-partner premises, you're wanting to go through sale and leaseback, perhaps the easiest way to avoid that is rather than waiting till you get down to the last 2 partners to find somebody to replace the second to last partner, just find somebody to replace every single time a partner leaves. Every single time a partner leaves, they have to remain on the lease until they find somebody to replace them as signatories on the lease. And then you'll never have an issue of getting down to those last 2 partners. And that's something that you can agree between the partnership. You can have that written into the partnership agreement. It'd be separate to the lease agreement with the landlord. It'd be a separate agreement, and it's something you could write into the partnership agreement potentially. Okay, and then the last downside to sale and leaseback, or the last thing you need to be aware of, is the potential tax implications. So capital gains tax, stamp duty, land tax and things. Always get specialist accountancy advice. I'm not going to start to tell you about what the tax laws are and tax implications are of sale and leasebacks, certainly not our area of expertise. So just speak to your accountant, just find out what those implications are so you're fully aware of what tax you're going to have to pay when you go through and sell the premises. And the last thing I want to talk about is kind of the process of sale and leaseback. So perhaps we've gone through the pros and the cons, and you're actually interested in going through the process of sale and leaseback, and how does that work? So the first thing that would happen is you'd contact a specialist surveyor, ideally a specialist surveyor. It doesn't have to be a specialist surveyor, but it's highly advisable you use a specialist surveyor who's got experience in the sector, is aware of the specialist investors that are out there, but also aware of the nuances that are involved in primary care and the specific lease clauses that you have to have in the lease that are very, very specific to primary care. So very important you use a specialist surveyor. That specialist surveyor, the first thing they would do is they can determine what the surgery is going to be worth on the open market. So they'd come and value the premises, give you an idea of what the likely outcome is and what you're likely going to achieve in terms of value for your GP practice. Once that's kind of agreed or determined or advised, if you're happy with that value, you want to proceed, then the next thing would be to draw up the heads of terms for a lease. So understand as a partnership what you want to insert into that lease, what you want to be responsible for, whether you want to be responsible for all the external and the internal, whether it's just going to be the internal repairs and maintenance of the premises, how long you want that lease to be, whether you want any break clauses, all sorts of different things. So the surveyor would understand what your requirements are for the lease. And then once you've got that lease agreed with the partnership, with the GP partners that are going to be signatories on the lease, that lease then needs to go and get approved by the ICB, a very, very vital stage of the process. Every lease in a GP surgery has to get approval from the ICB, because the ICB are effectively agreeing to reimburse you for the duration of the lease. So they have to undertake a value for money report to make sure from their point of view, it's value for money for you to sign a 15-year lease and then cover the rent for that period of time. So very, very important you get ICB approval. That can be an extremely frustrating part of the process. It can delay things significantly, but still it has to be done. So once you've had the surveyor give you an idea of what the surgery is valued, you've had those heads of terms agreed with the partnership, you've then got the approvals from the ICB, we're finally ready to go to market. So very, very different to selling your residential entity where you can ring an estate agent up on Friday and your house is on the market on Monday. That is not the case when you're selling a GP surgery. It can take 6, 9, 12 months before you even get to a stage of going to market. So just being aware that the process is quite long. So if you've got partners perhaps looking at retiring in 18 months or 2 years, now is probably a good time to start thinking about what your options are in terms of sale and leaseback. And that's pretty much it, really. If you've got any other questions or queries about sale and leaseback or some of the things we've talked about today, you want to learn a little bit more, feel free to give us a call. You can always like and share as well. There's plenty more videos, not just about sale and leaseback, but all sorts of different various premises matters. So get in touch with us today or in the future whenever it's necessary.